That's amazing.
Okay, folks, if people could begin to move to their seats, we're going to get started in about a minute. Want to get Claire? Well, now we're moving into the period, folks, in which we are trying to gather the learnings that have been so rich throughout the course of the day and begin to, that's very good, really, very good. We appointed Aneesh as the moderator. We didn't know he was going to be quite so good at modulating the tone levels, but just one of his many extraordinary skills. And there's nobody really more skilled than Aneesh to be able to lead us into a conversation that will help us to tee up ways in which we can improve the state of play, begin to think about the issues that are most important as next step mandates, and to draw out the perspectives of the chief executive officers of key healthcare delivery systems of all sorts and sizes that are clearly essential. So we have an individual who has served as the first Chief Technology Officer for the United States. He came to that, this was during the Obama administration, he came to that post after serving as the head of technology for the state of Virginia. And now is the president of CareJourney, which is an open data intelligence service that was launched by Hunch Analytics. Thank you very much, Aneesh.
All right,
Great
here we
to have
go.
you here.
Thank you so much. All right, everybody, we're going to do one of these. We're going to stretch. Unlike the earlier panels where we had more like presentation and then a few minutes of reaction, this is going to be a little bit of a conversation because we got to react to a lot of the insights that came out of the day, and we've got an incredibly talented panel. So what I'd like to do is set the stage up front with just a few minutes of opening remarks by each to answer the following questions. And it all comes down to this, sort of why you're here. Because when I first learned that the session was organized and CEOs were going to participate, I thought, man, we're talking about procurement and interoperability. This is in the weeds. And I can't imagine for the life of me the average CEO sort of getting into the weeds about, well, it's got to be the FHIR API constrained by the Argonaut project or nothing. And by the way, not a bad thing to say if you were to take on a language of that sort. So I was struck by what it is about this topic that motivated each of you to show up. And when answering the question, if you wouldn't mind to kind of think in your own mind on two dimensions. You've got a lot of items on the plate: regulatory changes, market pressures, the evolving, if you will, new entrants to this, this Amazon announcement this morning, whatever that's going to end up being. Where does this issue of procuring digital interoperability in healthcare rank amongst the myriad issues that come across your desk? And then secondly, tied to that, if you could kind of on a scale of 1 to 10 grade, where do you see the country's interoperability position? 1 being an abysmal, massive, nasty, terrible thing that's nowhere where it needs to be, and 10 being it's all solved, why are we having this meeting? Just give us a sense for where you are on that scale of crisis. Maybe that might inform the first part of the answer as to why you're here. We can go in order of the awesome people in this room, and Stephanie being, you were the first lady of Health IT, was that Chris Ross, was that your designation? I would second the notion. Stephanie, if you wouldn't mind, why are you here representing Hopkins, and how would you rank 1 to 10?
I think Chris called me a den mother or something. No, Chris was kind and gracious. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and a privilege. And I think the one consistent theme that is forever on our minds as CIOs is patient safety, and how that gets described or explained in terms of quality and value and cost and access and decision making. And I think we're especially fortunate at Hopkins that under Peter Pronevost's leadership, safety has become job one for all of us. It's number one on every agenda and every meeting, every discussion. And so I think I wanted to be here, and I'm glad I'm here because I don't think interoperability in and of itself is the issue. I think it's the problems that are caused by the absence of interoperability. One is that we certainly can't get a global view of what's happening to our populations or our patients. We can't get a precise view of what's happening to our patients. And we're terribly inefficient. And all of that results, I think, in issues associated with safety. The second question, though, where are we on this continuum regarding interoperability? My bias is that we're using the wrong language. If we're attempting to get people like Dr. Cosgrove to pay attention to procurement and purchasing and some of the important business decisions that need to be made, I think we need to speak in terms that people like Dr. Cosgrove can resonate with. And he being perhaps unusually well-informed about interoperability challenges, not every CEO is. And so I don't think it's an interoperability crisis. I think it's a complexity and safety and care crisis. I think it's a cost crisis and maybe a consumerism or coverage crisis. And so I think we need to think about the language we use and choose words that are much more meaningful to the people we support and the people we lead. And I think we may be missing an opportunity when we only use the word interoperability. So it's a serious issue. Is the crisis an interoperability crisis, or is it a care crisis and a population health crisis?
Give it a number. 1 is
National?
terrible, 10 is awesome.
4.
So it's erring on the side is still challenging. Thank you so much. Dr. Cosgrove, you were invoked. Does this language feel like a kind of a foreign language, or this is something you've captured, and why are you here?
Well, I'm here to learn, basically, but I know that I'm way in over my head, and I see two forces beginning to drive healthcare currently. Number one is the finances of healthcare, which is putting tremendous pressure on every aspect of healthcare and how we're going to deliver it to the entire population. And the second one, and frankly, that requires efficiency. And one of the things that is going to drive efficiency is data and the ability to deal with the data. And I think that right now we are swimming in data. If you look at 100 years ago, the total amount of knowledge in healthcare doubled every 150 years. By 2020, it'll be doubling every 73 days. And it is now clinically applicable when you begin to look at the human genome with 3 billion data points in every human genome. And so we have to learn how to manage that data. And I think that was brought home very clearly today by the announcement of Jamie Dimon, Warren Buffett, and Bezos, who essentially came out and said that they were going to work together and use technology to drive down costs in healthcare. And I was frankly delighted to see that, because I think it's been a very long time since the private sector has begun to recognize the importance of these particular issues in terms of cost. And if you look at it, there's a tremendous amount of things that the private sector can begin to drive that are not going to be able to be driven as efficiently by the federal government. So I think it's, I was delighted to see that. I think it highlights the problems that we have in healthcare, or at least two of them, and I would give us about a 4.
Wow, consistent. Thank you, sir. Steve.
Well, the reason I'm here is to learn, and I learned a great deal. And because of a long-time commitment to the value of integrated delivery, care management, and the tools you need to support it. So just in a nutshell, I'm a lifer. I've been at Montefiore and Einstein for 40 years. And since 1993, I was the chief medical officer, and 10 years ago, I became the CEO. And in the early 1990s, it was clear to us with an eroding payer mix, and by the way, our payer mix now, I love people's expression when I say this, is 85% governmental, of which 45% is Medicaid. So we're 15% commercial. Try that. Tell Paul that. And you can do it, although it becomes increasingly more difficult. It was our vision that Kaiser had it right. The difference between us and Kaiser is Kaiser, until recently, basically didn't have Medicaid. I believe that all should get care. So to provide the very best care and equal care, and by the way, at Montefiore, we do everything that any of the other vaulted institutions here do. We even separate twins at the head. We've done 5 successful ones, 2 of them at Montefiore, 3 elsewhere. We just started a lung transplant program. We do what the very best institutions across the country do. And it includes the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, which is a science institution and a tremendous mechanism for a pipeline for us, for who works for us, and I'm one of those examples, but you can argue that. So bottom line, in the mid-90s, we built a care management structure, an organization that exists to this day, 1,500 people that work there, and there's a lot of mechanisms, homegrown, that we have built to support it. And I won't go into them now, but I think they're relevant. We picked what was called, in my mind, was the epic of that day. It was called Famous. Frank Samples sold it to us. He had to convince us that he had enough money that it was going to survive. And it did survive long enough to be sold to IDX. And then a little while later, IDX sold it to GE. Where's my friend from GE? And we worked and worked and worked to appeal to them to finish the vision. During the meaningful use period of time, we spent more money than you can ever imagine to connect these systems of GEs that were not connected. The EHR, the lifetime medical record, inpatient, outpatient, was not. So I have always felt that that support would give us what we need to be able to take risk. Since '95, we have taken risk in the following fashion. I'll just say it quick. It's a risk transfer agreement. We don't have to have the reserves of an insurance company under the state of New York. It's Medicaid, Medicare, and commercial. The commercial is mostly city workers or hospital workers, $11.99. It is $2.5 billion. We're a $7 billion organization, 40,000 employees, and it spans everything, including a very large primary care platform, 250 institutions. We're in most of the schools, high schools and schools in the Bronx, and our footprint goes way up into the Hudson Valley. And still, we had to switch to Epic. And Epic's a good product, there's no question about it, but it doesn't play well with other products. It is just not simple to plug and play, as we said before. So, I think we'll have time to discuss all this. I still believe that, I may be one of the only CEOs in the country. I think, yes, it's true that in that almost 20% of the GDP we spend on healthcare, that it's a front for some of the social services that you would see in Europe. I agree with that. And maybe we're not deployed properly. But you still need to connect with those social services. I mean, they're not other. They are of us, and they are integral. We get people housing. We get people food. We send people home to 7 illegal 10-story walk-ups after a transplant, and we have to go in and clean their air conditioning. So you need those components in your system, and if you have mechanisms to do it in an easier way, more transparent way, bring people in so that they can see it, I think we're going to go a long way. So I will end with this. I've thought about this a lot. I talked to Peter. I think the proposal is a good one, but I strongly feel that it is the necessary one for sure, but not the one to get it done. It needs to be coupled with something else. And this is a hard time to work with certain parts of our government. But I would say, at the very least, the concept of regulation and mandate. And the mandate is reasonable. If we have, 60 million people in Medicare today, a lot of us are going to be in Medicare soon. And that population is growing. So Medicare, as an example, not necessarily the only way, could put it over, it would be the sufficient. It would put it over the line, because if they demanded it, if Medicare demanded it, it would work. I'm not optimistic we can get that right now. So I go back to large states. I live in a large state. A state like New York, I have advocated for that to discipline this part of our economy, which is not going away. So it's something along those lines, coupled with a vision that we make a pledge to. Thank you.
Steve, we're going to dive into that in a few minutes for sure. Can you just 1 to 10, if you given your history?
Yeah, I was going to do 5, but I think it's 4.
There may be an emerging consensus, Mike. Have the record note. Okay, Chris Ross, you've been introduced to us already. Why are you here other than your morning amazing slide run?
I'm here because our CEO from Arizona, Dr. Wyatt Decker, couldn't attend and sends his regrets. But it's probably my chance to say tart things about our knuckleheaded CIO and what he's doing. I think if Dr. Decker were here, he would agree strongly with what Dr. Safyer and Dr. Cosgrove just said around the mission that's required of the organization, the challenges from reimbursement, and I think this issue about exploding medical knowledge and yet at the same time the need to restrain cost. The thing that I would like to whisper in his ear and every other CEO's ear is the interoperability piece that I think every CEO in healthcare should worry about is interoperability by definition means fundamentally changing the relationship between patient, provider, payer, and multiple providers and so on. And it, by its very nature, changes the engagement model, it changes the competitive model, it creates opportunities to change the reimbursement model, all those kinds of things. So there's some tremendous promise in terms of what could we do to manage this explosion of medical data for the benefit of patients and do it cheaper. But there's also the possibility that just like every other industry that's gotten networked over the last 15 years, we haven't even begun to see what's going to happen to our industry as data starts moving from point to point in the network. I don't think we have the slightest idea how that's going to land, but I know it's going to be big because that's been the case in every other industry.
1 to 10.
I'd give it a 3.14159.
Oh, man.
A Russian joke.
What a source of humor. You all likely know our first 4 panelists. I want to just take a moment to a point of personal privilege to introduce you to Rene. When I served as Virginia's Secretary of Technology, before the High-Tech Act, in the Bush administration, they had this program to wire up federally qualified health centers. And Rene serves as the president of the Virginia Network of Federally Qualified Health Centers. Often that voice is missing from forums in this environment, life on the ground. And so just for introducing Rene, I wanted to give her the chance to say a word. Why are you here? And then we're going to get into some specific questions as we get into the meat of this session. Thank you, Rene.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Aneesh. I would say we all have so much on our plate, all CEOs, and even if you're not a CEO, I would like to say everybody out here I know has a lot on your plate also. But the way I look at the foundation of what's going on is and being able to predict where we need to go in the FQHC world, and I think most of you are familiar with FQHCs, but we serve the medically underserved, basically. And the network I have is all of the FQHCs in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so when I think of that, I think our foundation and our promise is our data. And when I think of basically what's going to happen in the future, I actually do read what ONC, big shout out to ONC, because you print a lot of stuff that I don't understand, but what I do understand means, wow, I really need to pay attention to this. So I've told my staff that I really want to be here because I look at interoperability and meaning so much, especially for highly transient populations that are served by FQHCs. But more important is because I see fire as the future-proof imperative. And I want you to think about that for a minute, because if we don't think of fire and interoperability and all of the promise that it offers, then we're not going to be future-proofed. And so I've got to look at this, not just where we are today, but where we're looking to go. I'm just going to take a swig here because I'm talking too much, and I'll keep it brief. But in terms of the ranking, I really want to talk about this a little bit. So I'm going to say I think we're at actually a 3. And I do think the ranking isn't really where I think we are. I think right now we're in a storm, and it's a good storm. The country my family's from, Cape Verde Islands, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of it unless you follow hurricanes, right? Because that's where all our hurricanes start. And we have a saying that says, calm seas have never made for a good navigator. And so right now we're in a storm. And that's good because we're able to navigate very closely and we're tackling this issue. So I would say we're in a storm. Let's stay together. Let's batten down the hatches, but we're going to all emerge in a better place.
Wow, thank you for that, Rene. I appreciate that very much. So we're going to now do a series of questions. They don't have to be long, and not all of you have to answer. So I may pick on some of you, or you may volunteer which ones you want to cover first. Secretary Shulkin started us this morning with a bit of an ask. He kind of publicly described his scenario. He's in the middle of a process, and he sort of, asked for feedback. We got it a little bit in the early panel, but we have an opportunity for CEOs and those representing your CEOs to kind of reflect on advice to the Secretary. So what I'd like to do to frame this question is a bit of the following. Index to day 0 when you were in his shoes. That is to say, you were on the verge of signing a contract with your big vendor, EHR vendor. And at the time, maybe you might share some context. How important was interoperability in the contract? Was it big deal or not? What were some of the assumptions you took going into the contract? And a little bit of your approach that you took to ensure what it was that you were able to hopefully do with respect to sharing information. I want to stick with your assumptions on that day. We'll come back to what happened. But if you wouldn't mind just putting yourself in the shoes of the Secretary, what were those assumptions so we can kind of level set, and then we'll get back into understanding whether those assumptions came out to be real and how you adjusted. And I'll allow any of you to start, but I might cold call Rene because you've had the most recent. You actually wrote fire requirements into a contract with your EHR vendor as in the last year. And so maybe you might share some context and how that happened and a little bit of the mindset.
Okay, yes, I'm surprised I still have a mind to have a mindset after that experience. But I just want to give a little bit of context here. Basically, I've been very excited about fire for a few years now. And we have a good conversation. 24 of the 26 centers that in the Commonwealth of Virginia are on eClinicalWorks. So we have a very good relationship with eClinicalWorks, and I have talked to them about how important we think fire is and that we wanted them to get on board. So we actually contracted with another entity to come up with a fire-enabled app. And what's exciting about this app is anybody who's familiar, and I'm sure you all are, with the social determinants of health, you know that a lot of healthcare a lot of what impacts healthcare takes place outside of a medical setting. So we partnered with the Richmond school system, and we said, okay, Richmond, the FQHCs have to come up with these UDS measures, Uniform Data Set measures from HRSA. And one of them is being able to get childhood immunizations. Well, what group has better data on childhood immunizations than school systems? And if our centers...
You smiling, Findell? What are you smiling for?
Yeah.
You agree?
Right, and so we had this developer create a fire-enabled app. We were able to get HRSA to agree to that our outcome measures for a particular HCCN grant, Health-Centered Controlled Network grant, would focus on creating fire-enabled apps. We were able to get the program officer from HRSA to get so excited about what we were doing. It spilled over to the Virginia Department of Health, and then even their grantor, CDC, wanted to hear about what we were doing with this fire-enabled app. Imagine this, we were able to not just get the school system engaged and on board, but every different group who had an idea of what the Richmond, inner city school system should be doing. So, and of course our providers were on board. So the stars are aligned, right? We've got this all happening. We've talked to eClinicalWorks. We've got the developer. And more importantly, we're not creating this app because it sounds good. It's got tremendous utility. It's a win-win for eClinicalWorks because they signed up for Sync for Science, right? And so they've made a promise. And their promise is that they're going to create this fire-enabled app. And before they were saying, oh, gee, we want to do it, but there's no one interested. And we said, hey, we're very interested. Pick me. And so they did. And of course, with the UDS measures, there's even greater utility. So we developed this app, and nothing's happening. Everything is languishing with eClinicalWorks, whatever. And so I feel like on one hand, what we thought was going to be the most difficult part, which is getting everybody aligned and excited and getting the school system and FQHCs to agree to share data in the first place. It's one thing to say an FQHC in a hospital, but a school system, like they're outside, although they shouldn't be, of the healthcare ecosystem. And we were able to get, school superintendent, everybody, not just willing to do this, but excited about it. And so I would just like to say, I do think that there's got to be a number of different levers that we have to push to make this happen. I thought I had pushed the levers. I'm a former attorney in the Office of General Counsel for CMS, so I'm used to the heavy levers, and what we wanted willing compliance, and yet it's been pretty difficult. So with that, I'll be quiet and listen to some suggestions that people may have.
And we're going to get audience questions in a minute, but this is not all vendor specific kind of commentary, but the point was, and the message to take was, you actually attempted to put procurement language describing what you had asked for, which is providing access,
right.
And it's still confusing, which is this idea of the assumptions at the time you signed and now reality and what the gaps are.
And they were very interested.
And so I'm just trying to keep up with that conversation of CEO level perspectives. Steve, when you want to comment, how did you think about it? Go back to day zero when you were kind of making that switch from famous, whatever that was, to this.
I have a comment to you, which is...
Okay. I'm all ears.
I'm sorry.
No.
FQHCs and the National Health Service Corps, which I'm sure are very important to you, and by the way, has not been renewed. It's at the moment going down.
We are politically free in this zone, sir. We're going to make sure we focus on... We're talking about IT procurement.
I paid for medical school with the National Health Service Corps. It is a piece of leverage when it comes back. So it's similar to the Medicare concept. I don't believe that the national insurers, Optum and Anthem and so forth, will fight to the bottom to get what Peter's trying to do. I could be wrong, and I would love to be wrong, but I think a governmental sector like Medicare or FQHCs could help you.
But Steve, you got the floor, so do you want to take a minute or two, or if not, anyone else, just go back to that day where you were in Shulkin's shoes, Mr. Secretary's shoes, and just give him a little bit of your window on, you made some assumptions, you took the leap, or you hesitated. I mean, obviously he's in the midst of this discussion. Toby, you had a comment about this. Did you want to just say a word about how you thought about it then and your advice to him now, or maybe we'll go on to the next topic?
One of the things that we did is in 2005, we made the decision to go to Epic. And the decision made at that point was we were starting to use another vendor. And it required that we scrap several $1 million worth of investment we'd already made. And we went to Epic at that time. I had the advantage or privilege or responsibility or duty, depending upon what day I was thinking about it, to serve for 10 months on the Commission on Care and trying to make suggestions to the VA. And it was very clear at that point that they had 130 versions of the electronic medical record. And our unanimous proposal from the committee was that they go to a vendor, one vendor. And that we did not think that they should continue to be an IT shop developing their own IT because they couldn't keep up and they needed to be uniform and have interoperability across the organization. You know, my advice to him was, you know, suck it up and do it. It's going to be painful. There'll be a lot of people who will object. But if you take the examples of Mass General, Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, Vanderbilt, all of whom switched from their homegrown IT system in the last 2 years to Epic, I think clearly it's something that can be done. So my main advice was get on to it. It shouldn't be an 8-year process.
Yes, sir, Steve.
So
Push the button.
5 years ago we switched to Epic, and I have to say that they were very responsive and reasonable about things like, you know, we're discussing here, and they've been helpful. The bottom line, though, is the greater, you know, connection to other things have, you know, at least two street, you know, it's coming from 2 different directions. So they've been good, and we were much more knowledgeable and not really naive with the original one, but just clueless. Didn't really know what should have been in that contract.
So let me flip it. Let me inverse the question in the other direction. Let's question the entire reason we're having this panel. Is procurement of interoperability itself a thing, or to some extent is it managing the house internally to ensure that it's adhering to what needs to get done to be capable of sharing information? And I'm wondering, Chris and Stephanie, since you're in the midst of implementation, could either of you comment about the notion of the framing language feels very much vendor must do X in the context of this discussion. I presume there's culpability that we've got to do Y in order to go from 130 systems to 1 and agree to physicians sharing common practices and the like. Would either of you wish to comment about, just give us a sense of your perspective here, how much of this is sort of vendor obligations to a set of requirements versus internal capacity to adjust or change? I don't know if that's a 100 pennies exercise, which allocation to which side, 50-50, 70-30. Stephanie, you're welcome to go first, or Chris. You're both experienced in this implementation burden.
Sure. So we signed our contract with Epic long before the word FHIR was known and long before many of us were even doing effective HL7 work. It was November of 1990. When we signed our first contract with Epic, they had 34 employees, a little tiny company, and we decided that they could help us achieve what we referred to as the ideal patient experience. So the term interoperability didn't come up. However, we renegotiated the contract in 2011, and it did come up. And perhaps this is an incredibly naive statement, but after being in the industry about 35 years, I think we decided that if we had to be explicit in the contract with a company with whom we had already been working for 25 years about the very, very precise expectations associated with interoperability, we didn't have the right partner. So we renegotiated or extended or wrote an amendment to a very old contract and said, we're both in this 100%. So to do your scale, I think it's 100%, 100%. And we decided that it was the right thing to do for our patients and for our providers. Have there been speed bumps? Absolutely. Are our faculty all joyous? No. In fact, I think they've blamed the earthquake and the hurricanes and a number of other natural disasters on the fact that we implemented Epic. But you know, it is challenging to use these systems, no matter which ones they are, and it's our job to make it work for our patients and for our providers as best we can, and that is a partnership. It's one built on trust and many years of working together.
Chris, any reaction to that? It's kind of hard for the public sector to procure based on trust. This is the challenge. No.
That was not the question.
No. I'm trying to translate to my opening statement about the advice to Secretary Shulkin and the feedback on this. But your sense of change and how that compared to the procurement piece.
So we negotiated our agreement and signed it with Epic in February of 2015. And actually, we negotiated prior to our decision contracts with both Epic and Cerner. We are currently a Cerner customer, and we run GE famous IDX in Rochester, which is what we're replacing. And I would say with respect to the interoperability issues, our contracts between those two companies was more or less identical, and called for adherence to standards and best practice and some aspirational kind of language and then some performance guarantee stuff, the kinds of things you would expect circa early 2015. And neither company had any pushback with that, and they were quite agreeable and in some cases pushed us. I would say that where we fail to support interoperability, it's 80% our fault and 20% the vendor, modulo the fact that the industry immaturity is kind of the biggest piece, but moving in the right direction. It is difficult even at a healthcare organization like Mayo, which focuses a lot on destination medical care and referral care, like Cleveland, like Hopkins, like others. We're still not very good at making that patient experience what it needs to be in terms of someone getting all of their records to us consuming them, us taking full action on them, and then us returning results in the right way back to the patient and their place of care. And I say that not because I think we really stink at it or we have bad experiences with it, it's just the opportunity is unlimited to do a much, much better job. Avoid unnecessary costs. Why do we have to do the labs again? You know, we do a lot of imaging in labs that we probably don't have to do, that we could get out of the way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many things we could do better.
Well, let's use that as a springboard to a couple of more kind of in the news and more dynamic perspectives from what you did at the time you were involved in the contract and what it allows you to do. Stephanie, I will ask you, you are the one member of this panel that did appear in the magical Apple announcement as being one of the early adopters. I'm sure there are many in the room who are keen. Just to answer it in 3 ways, if you wouldn't mind. First is, did you have to change your contract to allow you to do it? In other words, you have the flexibility to do it. That's the first question. Confirm that. Second is, did it require you to do anything special? Did you have to invest resources, buy products, do something? And then maybe the implication, if I will, for others is what you anticipate the experience being like when Monty wants to connect, or the Cleveland Clinic, or Mayo, or the Federally Qualified Health Center system in Virginia. Just any perspective so we can level set what it was that you did there, and then we can come back to this conversation of interoperability and the procurement process.
Sure. So we started having conversations with Apple about the topic maybe 6 months ago, and didn't know what we didn't know at the time, and nor did they. And talked about the possibility of an app that would be empowering and enabling for our patients, a very patient-centric solution that would run on the one single piece of hardware that they want to sell more of. And it made sense to us. We didn't have to buy anything. We didn't have to change our contract with Epic. We didn't have to sign an onerous agreement. It was built on a belief that we both had skin in the game, and it was something that we wanted to do for our patients. Thinking about next steps and going forward, I don't believe I have a perfect answer to that question. I think we believe that what's been identified, and you saw it in the press releases, the things that will be able to be presented to a patient on their phone is an important step, but it's just a first step. I think what the possibilities are not endless, but there are many opportunities for consumers to drive a degree of interoperability, perhaps, that we haven't yet seen, for consumers to participate in the collection and aggregation of data and the interventions that may result from that collection of data. I think there will be a tricky bit if as a result of this, we need to make, in the future, we need to make any significant changes to the Epic environment. There may be some challenges associated with that. As of this moment, we don't anticipate much of that happening, but it could. And if app developers latch on to this and do really clever things, there may be some challenges associated with that level of integration between Epic and app developers in their app orchard. So we've not made any promises to do any of that kind of work, but I think that's when we might start to see some of the challenges you're alluding to.
My follow-up question is going to segue into the last question for the panel, and then Jim, we can start having us kind of have a dialogue around this. But it comes to the anxiety that we heard in the Secretary's voice this morning, and I think came through a number of panels around this idea of future-proofing. So here's how I want to frame the follow-up to you, Stephanie, and then I'm going to ask the panel for some reaction. I know nothing about the Amazon announcement. Literally, I know nothing. But let's speculate for a moment. It involves the collective employees for the three companies.
It does.
So now they decide to put an app in the hands of their employees. It could be one app. It could be choose your own adventure, many apps. Do they have to go through 6 months of negotiation with you to have that quote-unquote employee app connect in the manner similar to what Apple was able to do? Could you share a word about that? And then I'm going to use that as a springboard for the discussion.
So based on the press release that I read this morning, and this is for the 1 million patients, 1 million employees that they manage and their dependents, it's a big deal. I see it as a purchasing procurement opportunity. Maybe just buying pharmaceuticals could save a ton of money if they're able to do that through Amazon. Your question, do they have to negotiate something with me to get information?
In the same manner that you made it available to Apple. Chris is giving you the answer in a little...
go ahead, Chris.
I don't know, but I would assume...
Speculate, brother, speculate, because I know where we want to take it, so speculate and go.
I would assume no, right? I mean, I'm trying to imagine what kind of information a employer-patient app would want that the Apple app doesn't want, and that isn't available through common FHIR services, right?
So the setup to this question, and thank you, because we didn't prepare in advance to have like a programmatic response, was that the announcement was basically the following, Chuck Jaffe, that if the hospital system or the physician's office publishes the FHIR API in accordance with the Argonaut project specifications, all that has to happen is a testing of the endpoint that it meets the spec and it's not fake news. And if that happens, it can work. I don't want to overstate that, Stephanie, but that's the characterization. Steve?
No, I just have a question, or anybody. Would the employee patient have to sign something to say
no, this is so you're going into hot space, man. Yes, keep going.
Because it would seem to me that, you know, I mean, I'm thinking about any of us. I mean, it's an interesting leap, potentially a very good one, but it is, you know.
The question that I was going to pose to the group was around future proofing, and the context of this discussion is the following. At the time Stephanie signed her 2011 contract, there had not been Fire APIs, and there had not been Apple requesting 6 months of conversation about whether it works or it doesn't work. And yet, in the framework, you were able to make something happen that didn't cost you money. You didn't install third-party middleware. You didn't have to do XYZ things. What had to happen was your vendor supported a standards process, and it followed the specs of the standard, and it worked. I'm not paraphrasing, but that sounds right? Okay. And the question was, this question of future-proofing, let's imagine about 2 panels earlier, there was this sort of aha moment. All we need is the clinical encounters. I've heard that, I don't remember the name of the person, but someone had commented the power of clinical encounters. And I was immediately like, oh man, bummer. That is not in the Argonaut spec. Oh, and bummer, it is, I don't know where it is in the roadmap. And Macaulay will tell me where we are. Mickey left, maybe we'd know. So let's, for the sake of discussion, say Amazon and Apple or Two Kids in a Garage have complied with the notion they can do this. This is the future-proofing question. But next month, they say, gosh, we'd love to get fire-based encounters. But there is no standard spec that's been vetted. It's not gone through Argonaut. How might you, would you be allowed, or how might you contemplate supporting that requirement if it comes? Toby, you may not get in the weeds of this, but you obviously famously did the deal with Walmart. I presume they had requirements of you in terms of information sharing. What I'm trying to get my arms around is, I think that was the Secretary's anxiety and maybe the core of this in many ways, the day. How do you ensure that you've got the right, you're not custom having to build whatever needs to, you're not spending 6 months of custom work for one Apple and then you have to do 6 months for someone else. You do once and use many. How have you thought about that notion of future-proofing, whether you've got advice to the report, to Peter's committee, how you did it or you didn't do it, how you might do it? And frankly, thinking about that as a practical reality. It came up today, someone's going to get excited, they're going to say, I'd love encounters next week. It may not be coming out for a long while. How do you think about it? I'll let any of you start where you want to go, or Toby, if you want to go back to the Walmart experience, if there was an analogy there at all. If not, we'll move to your perspectives. And then, Jim, we might bring you in. Any reaction to this conversation? Do you have that anxiety? Is it an obscure anxiety? Is it real? How do you think about it? Yeah, Steve.
I mean, just as a point of fact, J.P. Morgan Chase uses United as an intermediary.
Got it. So it's on Peter's job to decide.
They take the risk themselves, but they have someone else manage it because there's an inherent conflict of interest.
You got it.
Okay, so the way I think about this, I think it's a good thing. And there should be standards for being able to do that, but there will be, to connect seamlessly and transfer information that but you would have to sign off on it. There's certain areas in this, in interoperability, where one has to say this is beyond the usual, and I want to sign it. That's how I would think about it if I was a patient.
And Chris, you can.
So the road works.
Yeah.
It's the same road, but there's a gate, and the gate goes up when you sign a document.
Any procurement reactions to this idea of cool things happen in the news, you want to react, you want to be a part of the group, it's not out of the box from the system? Rene gave us a very telling example. It's not out of the box. She's trying to do care gap closures. Chris, how do you think about future-proofing in the procurement context?
Well, I've been trying to absorb your question. I guess an insight I might share would be Eric Schmidt, former CEO and executive chairman of Google, serves on our board of trustees. And the advice that he gave us from industry perspective was work really hard, whether it was us or the industry, on getting the interface specs right. Be careful with the engineering, make tough decisions, and then once that's done, the rest of it is kind of throwaway. So, future-proofing in technology is a sucker's bet. I mean, the half-life of code in the world right now has got to be about 9 months. So I guess I'm not worried so much, and maybe my CEO, if he was here, would disagree, but I'm not worried about future cost. What I'm worried about is repaying technical debt for bad decisions made. That's really expensive. Mayo is paying a lot of money to pay technical debt to get to the right platform. The expense to build new leaning forward is inconsequential relative to those decisions of regret. So the decisions of regret, I think, are, think about the core stuff in the most forward-leaning way you can without being bleeding edge. Do the engineering right. Think really hard about it. Commit to non-proprietary open standards. And then the rest of it is foam. Make investments, throw it away, try stuff, fail, move on.
The temporary kludge.
I think so. And so, Fire apps, we were able to consume some smart on Fire apps into our environment by building APIs that conform to Fire. It was really expensive for us to build Fire APIs. I think we have 75 or something like that in production right now. We're trying to commit to the standard fully. Have we overinvested there? Maybe a little bit ahead of the market, but it allowed us to take something in from Boston's Children, and we ran it without modification. And that's pretty cool.
Well, that's a very powerful set of conversations. I know, again, at the outset, hard to get the CEO level and the weeds of the discussion that we had today, but I appreciate your perspectives. Jim, you had our first question, and now I think we want to spend the time getting you involved in this discussion.
Yeah, thanks. My question was really about as the world changes, I know there's a lot of uncertainty, but the idea of this open marketplace for app development, as I was alluding to in my discussion, I'm curious whether, in the past we've had controls so that the doctor-patient relationship where the patient comes in and says, what do you think of this app? Which app should I use, doc, right? And maybe it doesn't meet muster for, forget the technical requirements, but it's just erroneous or not giving good advice. And I'm curious about liability for how are you planning to put in place some sort of vetting for quality of apps so that there can be some sort of approval process so we don't end up becoming infamous instead of famous, right? And then the second piece of that is, of course, in developing apps that might be episodes of care where you're now facing clinicians, my guess is there'll be an iterative process, and just signing something where Apple can work with the EMR is not enough. You're going to want to involve your clinicians in making sure that iteratively the product actually works well. And so that they're similar. They're consequences of, I don't think it's as simple as just an open API and we're all just going to trust. Some of it has to do with quality certification of apps, and the other has to do with ongoing development, which will imply cost to you.
I wish the answer was a simple one. We do have a number of ways through which we certify apps, but and maybe Dr. Pronovost has a different answer to this from the perspective of the Armstrong Institute. I believe that for the most part, what we do is put in place guiding principles for how things need to function and a review process by which things get approved. But I also believe we are passionate about innovation and science and discovery and promote that kind of creativity. So I'm personally unaware of an opportunity that has presented itself where we have said, no, that's not an acceptable solution. What we've said instead is work with us to make it an acceptable solution. And only then would we be willing to support it in our environment. But I wouldn't want to mislead you. I don't think that necessarily suggests that there aren't things going on that are equally creative that may not necessarily go through as rigorous a review process. Peter, any? Yeah.
Stephanie, just to follow up on Jim's question, a patient who puts the data from your systems into HealthKit and then from that downloads a Cerner app that tells them something meaningful doesn't have to come back to you for permission.
Not
just
at all.
To clarify.
Not at all. Sorry if I misunderstood.
No.
That would be
I just want to bring that point home because there's a slightly different discussion between apps prescribed by a doctor at your institution versus those that are connected. Let's go over here. Anyone want to react to that question as well? Yes, please, Matt. Matt, remind us who you are if you don't mind.
I am Matt Quinn. I'm the Senior Advisor for Health Technology at HRSA. So I'm so happy to hear about.
Be nice to Rene. Help her. Give her some. Follow Steve's advice. Give her some leverage.
Health Center Control Networks. Health centers do wonderful work. I'm going to be a little bit hyperbolic, it being late in the day.
Go for it.
And say one of the biggest barriers to a functioning market in health IT, in EHRs, is an interoperability use case around switching from an EHR around which you're dissatisfied to one that suits you better. The switching costs are extremely high. And if you're dissatisfied, you're going to have to go through, you're going to have to be really dissatisfied and go through a lot of pain. Why is this? Well, each EHR system has a proprietary user interface, so you're going to have to train everybody that red means green now and green means red and blue means orange, and workflows. Proprietary logic in between, a proprietary data model, so all of the data that you had is probably going to be lost. And then you're also probably going to have to switch thousands of custom interfaces just for that, right? And so, as we think of the future, each of those probably has their own app marketplace. There was a quote a couple of weeks ago from a CEO of a health system who said, and I will not talk about who this is, I will submit that one of the biggest impediments to innovation in healthcare is our EHR vendor. Because the way that this EHR vendor thinks about their intellectual property and the IP of others that develop on that platform. There are literally billions of dollars in Silicon Valley chasing innovation in healthcare. And yet this EHR vendor has architected an organization that has its belief that all good ideas are from that EHR vendor. And off chance that one of us thinks of a good idea, it's still owned by that EHR vendor. As we think about future-proofing...
Man, you're going right for the jugular. What's going on, brother? It's the end of the day, man. It's when you have to talk.
I'm just saying...
Happy talk. Hashtag, boom.
Well, as we think about this, how do we attack that if you're a health center and your vendor won't do what you need them to do? Or if you're a health system and you don't want to rip out all those users.
We're all waiting for the hyperbole in your statement.
Yeah.
Why can't you just switch the guts underneath and keep your user interface? Or why can't you get your data and move seamlessly to another EHR platform without the problems being high? Should this be our top interoperability use case?
I mean, Rene, I don't want to put you on the spot, but obviously, given the news, you've been quite involved in this type of conversation. Do you wish to say a word, 2, 3, react?
You hit the nail on the head in terms of what we need and the questions that need to be answered, not just asked, because we also feel constrained, and we're also financially constrained in a way that probably most others in this room aren't.
Hospitals that are flush with cash.
Yeah, well, we'll just maybe have a little bit more than we do. And so if in fact we're working at cross purposes, I think, sometime with the EHR vendors, and we'd like to be on the same page, but we're not, because what we'd like to do, sometime I think what they hear is, you're cutting into my profit margin. And it's hard to walk that tightrope. So I don't know what the answer is, but I agree, those are salient questions.
Well, maybe Stephanie. I mean, yeah, please, Stephanie.
So I don't agree with the premise. I think that what investments in products like Cerner and Epic can do, if done well, is provide you with a very rich and stable foundation upon which you can innovate. And I think that's hard work. And I think it takes engagement of providers and administrators and business leaders and technologists to make it happen. But I think the absence of that foundation can make innovation even more difficult, hence the decision to migrate away from Vista, because it takes so much energy and effort to keep 137 versions of something running. So I think the premise is flawed. I do believe that the foundation can afford you an opportunity to be more nimble and more creative if you have the energy and expertise to do that. And I think we're blessed at Hopkins that we do. And we have incredibly well-engaged faculty who drive us every day to do something more creative and innovative, building on top of what we already own. The other answer, though, about switching costs, and I can only use our example, but I would suspect it's true for my colleagues on this panel, Epic isn't Epic. Epic at Hopkins is it's part of who we are. The way complex chemotherapeutic order management is done in Epic is the way we do it at Hopkins, and Epic affords us that opportunity to do it in a way that is consistent with what Dr. Bill Nelson wants us to do in oncology. So switching cost isn't just switching software and hardware. It's taking the heart and soul of what we built into pediatric oncology to make it safe for those sick kids and doing it over again. So it's not just the software, it's the part of our heart and soul that we poured into the software.
Steve, you had a comment, or Chris, and then I want to bring in Michael.
I just want to pile on what Stephanie said. I completely agree. So we're in the process of configuring our EHR and revenue cycle system, and I don't have the numbers exactly right, but they're close enough that this is true. The part where we're configuring the clinical part of our application, 80% of the expense is exactly what Stephanie said. It's workflow optimization, it's doing clinical practice. On the revenue cycle side, 80% of the cost is acquiring the software and putting it in because it's commodified and there's nothing unique or distinct about it whatsoever. So I think if EHRs begin to become more and more commoditized because there's a standard of care that we all do things the same way, then EHRs will get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. But it's still the case we're in a discovery mode. We're in the, I don't know what generation of EHR. I turn to my colleagues from Cerner and Epic to kind of guess on it. Maybe we're on Rev 5, Rev 6. I don't know. By the time we get to 10 or 15, which every industry gets to, then it'll be less expensive, more commoditized, and the locus of innovation will move someplace else.
Steve?
Just quick. I mean, we're in a love fest with Epic right now. And a lot of that has to do with what we were able to change by installing it. But to be very fair to them, like Healthy Planet, which is their sort of care management piece, they've helped us design something that's appropriate for us that we can use, albeit it's on their platform, of course, and albeit they'll probably monetize it better than I did. But it's worked fine. I mean, it's really been good. Now, but that's compared to what, you know, and you know, that's. I think there are broader issues.
I saw a bunch of cards go up. We're gonna go Michael, David, and then if I saw a couple more, Ayal, go ahead.
I do have a question, but I can't pass up the opportunity for an advertisement for the question about apps and how do you navigate. Late last year, AMA, HIMSS, American Heart Association, and a little outfit called DHX Group announced the formation of a nonprofit called Exertia. And Exertia.org just published a draft set of guidelines for the mobile app community, and that we invite public comment on. It's by no means the end product, and that's why it's out for public comment. And if anyone goes to Exertia.org, you can review the guidelines in their draft form and you can comment on them. Now the question, but I'll precede the question with a predicate, and I suppose you could challenge the predicate. But you know, all day we've been talking about how difficult it is to achieve interoperability between hospitals and within systems, and the evidence that what we've done hasn't really moved the needle on outcomes. The predicate that I would state and then ask the question is that I don't think we can improve outcomes if we continue to manage chronic disease in the brick and mortar environment of the hospital and the clinic. That we can only successfully manage chronic disease out in the wild. And there's increasing evidence, it's spotty still, but it's growing, that for things like congestive heart failure, the management of hypertension, which we're only successful in 50% of the time, you know, let that sink in. Hypertension should be easy to gain control. We only gain control 50% of the time. So I would really like to hear from the CEOs how you view the challenge, if you believe, as I've stated, that we can improve outcomes in chronic disease management within the brick and mortar environment.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more. You know, it doesn't end when somebody leaves the hospital, and the best outcomes are people that don't need to get admitted. So yes, we've been working on that for a very long period of time. Nonetheless, we'd be very unsuccessful if the 400,000 people that we take risks for were ever in the hospital. We'd be failing. So that's maybe 10% of 4,000 beds. So the people that are in the hospital tend to be people that are coming into the emergency room and are not locked into some kind of care management, for lack of a better word. Where we are.
Toby?
Yeah, we think that both hypertension and diabetes are going to be managed distally because you ought to be able to report both the blood pressure and the glucose levels and probably manage most of those with an algorithm. And so we've set up a separate set of facilities to manage those two issues as a starter.
Thank you very much. Rene, any comment?
And
Yeah.
I'd just like to say too.
Yep. Well, I'm going to do one friendly amendment to yours, Rene. You could use the basis to discuss. Steve, do you make Meals on Wheels sign a BAA if they want to share data with you? It's kind of a mean thing to say in the last minute here, but it's a metaphor to the conversation I think, Michael, you were taking me to.
We don't.
No, and I said that somewhat facetiously, but it actually is a legitimate challenge. Today, if you were to share your data with Meals on Wheels to help coordinate that care, technically speaking, your IT department and your CISO is going to mandate some kind of HIPAA security BAA, where I can't imagine the Meals on Wheels team can afford the work to be, being somewhat facetious, but actually kind of serious. So I'm just curious in the context of interoperability, Mike, where I think you were taking us is, if it's moving us into settings that are not kind of resourced to meet the health IT burden, how on earth are we going to get interoperability? I have an opinion, but I can't say it on this room. I don't know if it's even come up to your attention, Steve.
Well, it doesn't on a regular basis, but the mandate is that for patients that are homeless, we connect them to people who can get housing for them. For patients that are in the emergency room who are, have various chronic illnesses but don't really need to be in the hospital, there are mechanisms in the community that we can refer to people to. Food is a huge issue. I mean, parts of our footprint, it's either a swamp or a desert for food. And there isn't such a thing. And we work in those communities to teach the bodegas that they don't need Pepsi-Cola, who wants to give them all their coolers if they only have Pepsi-Cola to sell. So we show them how they can make a living and do a good thing. And also, single wrap cigarettes, that's a big deal in K2. So we work with them to change their business, but I'm sure we're in unclear zones when we do that.
It is interesting for the chapter, Peter, if we did, I don't remember if that part is in the piece, but the non-provider issue is an issue. Rene, I cut you off. You had a comment?
No, it's okay. Actually,
David had a comment, and then Ayal.
Hey, my comment was way back on the Apple APIs, so I don't know.
Oh, come on back. Bring it back, brother. Say something.
I think what Apple is doing is leveraging the required APIs under the 2015 certification edition, which is
that's what I was hoping. Yes,
is the regulatory driver that the vendors are obligated to support. What Argonaut did was to step in with a group of vendors and providers to say, let's do this the same way, so these apps have a chance of working across our systems. What is unknown is what comes next. So each of the vendors is creating their own next steps. They're continuing to expand which APIs they support, but it's not being driven by a particular regulatory requirement or by necessarily any other agreement. So Argonaut just had another round of balloting amongst its members, you were present, to decide what we standardize next, what do we attack next. And just with respect to your question about encounters, the one at the top of the list is clinical documents linked to encounters. So that's likely to be, the top choice. And I bring it all up just to say, there's a couple of different ways you solve these problems, with a little bit of a forcing function where you have a regulatory declaration that this is going to happen. Vendors and providers and anyone else that's relevant, in this case now Apple's a part of the conversation, consumers, go figure out how to do it before we put a regulation in place that's a bad choice for a standard. and then the community gets together and figures out how to do it. And I think that cycle can iterate. I think we've shown how to
David,
do it.
that's a great segue to this question, which I just want to pose to the group. And I was thinking, but I didn't want to put a burden on Toby or Stephen as CEOs to get into these weeds. But let's just take David's comment. It was in the news that the Cleveland Clinic used FHIR to facilitate scheduling resources be made available to an insurance company called Oscar, where they've got a pretty cool, and you're welcome to say a word or two about that, Toby, if you'd like. But to the question, David, that I want to just throw out there for that piece of this thread, the scheduling resource hasn't been officially completed in the Argonaut process. So in the construct of, can I procure a vetted standard, I would characterize scheduling as not yet complete, right? We haven't balloted, if you will, the implementation guide yet. The institution was free to meet a requirement using best available version of it that they felt comfortable moving forward. And I bring that up only in the context of this sort of mucky middle, where if a standard is known and available, like Apple leveraged the Argonaut project, the meaningful use requirements that Don is now overseeing, there's really no judgment. There's no BAA, there's no investment of procurement efforts, so that the vehicles work. Where there's no standard, then you're doing a custom project. Chris, you mentioned the investment you made in 75 resources. This mucky middle is, it's kind of working. There's sort of a resource. You could point to one. It's maybe not officially vetted, but it's sort of good enough and I want to use it. How is that addressed in procurement, if at all? And how might that advice feed into this model, which is, what do you do with the mucky middle where it's a standard that I want to reference or I want to have availability, but it hasn't been officially decreed as such, so it's sort of not maybe formally mature. Toby, that's in the weeds, and I told you earlier I don't want to put you on the spot for that level of weeds, unless you wanted to just comment on why you chose to relate to Oscar and offer this service, because it was a different open standards method of communication than a custom interface.
I would say that what we're doing with Oscar is we appreciated the technology that they brought to the table. We think that this is an opportunity for us to begin to reach out to our patients in a more direct fashion using the technology, and so we have formed a joint partnership with Oscar to try and take advantage of that technology.
Yeah, and Steve?
Oscar's...
Well, it was bleeping. Bleeping is a bad thing, but there you go. Yep.
Yeah, we've been with Oscar for 3 years. It is an incredibly innovative organization. And in many ways would be my ideal of where a large segment of the population should go. It's an interesting experiment for us in the footprint we have, but it hasn't grown as much as we thought. But it has executed beautifully. I mean, it is, you really can communicate and get what you need or learn that you don't need that. And it really works. So it's an insurance company with an app. How's that?
And
on steroids.
Steve, the reason I brought that up in this context was...
It is.
It's a technology.
You're right.
Company.
Yeah, I brought it up mostly because in the case that Stephanie described, she did the thing with Apple, but then anybody else could use the same endpoint. So it's not like she did it just for Apple. It's open to everybody. Toby did the scheduling thing with Oscar in the same way, that it's potentially available to everybody, even though it was tested with Oscar. That's not normally the case, and these gray areas are an area that I think we're not going to solve on this panel, but is a flag of what do you do in that middle, or to the point of the Vice Admiral Bono when she was here on the subject of, frankly, the role of the public, the DoD and the VA involving in these standards efforts. Neither the DoD or the VA had a quote-unquote vote, if you will, in the Argonaut process. Not that they should or shouldn't have or whatever, but as a buyer of services, their voice, indirectly maybe there through the people that they work with. Ayal, you had a comment, and then we got 5 more minutes for any final questions, and then we can wrap. Yes? Any other questions as we dive into this? Yes, Doug Fritzma. Bring us home, brother. Say something provocative and thoughtful so we can have a nice discussion about it.
So I'll just lead with that?
Yes, please.
So I think EHRs are not the technology of the future. I feel like we're in the mainframe stage of health IT, where all these CEOs are spending millions of dollars buying expensive equipment and redesigning their entire organization around it. just like the finance industry used to do when they bought big accounting systems and they would redesign all their processes. I think that somebody's going to invent the PC equivalent. You know, maybe it's Apple that they've already done that or the like. And I think as we move from a focus on treating sickness to one in encouraging health, where it's going to accelerate that kind of mainframe mentality into one that's going to be a much more personalized experience. I mean, I think a lot of folks see the technology as a way of tethering patients to their systems, but patients spend, you know, maybe less than 2 hours a year, most of them engaged in the healthcare enterprise. And they probably spend 2 hours a day on social media. And when you start talking about social determinants of health, and you start talking about Meals on Wheels, and you start talking about those things, I think the challenge we have is that we have this mainframe mentality and these silos of excellence, but healthcare and wellness is going to be a horizontal integration and not a vertical one.
So bring us home and talk about the procurement implications of that transition. Is there a clause that should be written that says, as we transition from mainframe to PC, I want to be able to port all the data?
Part of it is a question. I mean, the only technology you never change is the technology you never use. So if you're going to create kind of these procurements, you know, you either have to take the Stephanie Reel approach where you establish a long-term trust relationship that allows you to sort of have unwritten rules and be able to move forward with that, or you've got to figure out a way that you can evolve over time so that you don't get locked in to a particular, you know, standardized approach or things like that. I mean, to me, good software engineering is about developing levels of abstraction that allow you to isolate certain aspects of your technology so you can create substitutability. You can take something out and put it in and it doesn't disrupt the rest of the stuff there.
Does that have to be procured in that? That's this is the provocative question of the day. Is there a gap in how we procure in the 100-page report, and are there recommendations to adjust it so that we have that type of perspective come
I don't
to
think
life?
you can use procurement as the only engine to be able to get there.
That's
and I think we have to figure out, well, what is the lever that procurement helps us get to? But I think even more importantly, it's the opposite. How can we prevent procurement from holding us back to going to that next stage or that next level? So I'd actually, in some sense, flip it around a little bit. How can we prevent procurement from allowing us to advance to the next thing?
Thank you. And Stephanie, bring us home with something spirited and positive and inspiring us to
Don't
get out of
screw
here.
it
Come on,
up, Doug.
Stephanie.
No. Doug, I think you're absolutely right. I think the challenge is to find out how to modularize those decisions and, if necessary, replace the foundation as well. But if not necessary, then ensure that you're in a position where you can modularize those things that can be swapped out. And I think perhaps an analogy might be what happened in the financial space with ERP solutions, where we bought either Oracle or we bought SAP. You'd be hard-pressed to go buy everything SAP today. You would buy perhaps GL, you'd buy a foundation in SAP maybe, and then you'd buy bits and pieces of cloud-based solutions like Workday or other solutions similar. And I suspect that's exactly where we will go. The difficulty that people like Dr. Cosgrove may have with us if we make those kinds of decisions is, how is that different than that best of breed thing that I spent 20 years trying to get rid of? Because we had 275 applications before. Well, we still have quite a few, but we had at least 275 before we migrated the foundation to Epic. And one might have argued that we were creating chaos and complexity that was also dangerous. And I think we have to find the path to get to where you're suggesting, but do it in a way that's rational.